Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're jumping into something pretty fascinating, actually.
Oh, yeah.
It's about how these big AI models, LLMs, large language models,
Yeah.
how they tackle really complex problems.
Yeah.
They often use this technique called chain of thought.
Right. CoT. It's basically like showing your work step by step.
Exactly. Instead of just spitting out the final answer. And the whole idea, the promise, is that this helps them reason better, get to the right solution, especially when things get tricky.
That's definitely the common wisdom. It feels intuitive, doesn't it? The more steps, the more detailed the thinking.
Yeah, the better the answer should be.
The more likely you are to catch mistakes and cover all the bases.
Yeah.
Break it down completely.
Totally. It's like if you got a really tough problem, you just need to think more, right? Spend more time, more steps. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, we've been digging into this research paper. It's called When More is Less. Understanding Chain of Thought Length in LLMs.
Ah, okay. When more is less. That title kind of gives it away.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because the big finding, the thing that really stands out, is that longer thinking, a longer chain of thought, it isn't always better for these models.
Which really flips that initial idea on its head.
Exactly.
And the paper, it has this great chart, figure 1, that illustrates it perfectly.
Right, the U-shaped curve.
Yeah. It shows performance on math problems. As the LLMs use more reasoning steps, their accuracy goes up.
Which is what you'd expect.
But only up to a certain point. Then, if they keep adding steps, performance actually starts to drop.
It's like they hit a sweet spot, and then, boom, diminishing returns. Or worse.
Exactly. It's almost like the model starts, overthinking it, gets tangled up.
Overthinking. That's precisely the term they use.
Yeah.
They talk about this balance between underthinking
Not enough steps.
and overthinking. Too many steps. So our mission today for this deep dive is to really unpack this nuanced link between how long an LLM thinks with CoT and how well it actually does.
Okay. So why isn't longer always better? What determines that sweet spot, that optimal length?
And what does it all mean for, actually using these things effectively?
Right.
We'll get into the theory, but also look at what happened when they tested this on real-world data, too.
Sounds good. So how did they even start investigating this?
Well, they began with something pretty controlled. They set up these synthetic arithmetic tasks, like little decision trees made of additions.
So they could precisely control how hard the problem was.
Exactly.
Okay.
And critically, they could also dictate how many steps the LLM had to take to solve it.
Okay, so total control over task difficulty and reasoning length.
Right. And what they found, which is what creates that U-shape in figure 1, was really consistent.
For different models.
Yeah. Whether it was a smaller model, like a smaller version of GPT-2, or a bigger one. And it held true across different levels of problem difficulty, too.
So what was the pattern?
As they forced the models to use more reasoning steps, accuracy would climb, hit a peak,
Right.
and then start to fall. Every time. It wasn't just this steady improvement the longer it thought.
Okay, so that immediately tells us something's going on, there's a trade-off. Breaking down the problem helps, but stretch it out too much.
And something goes wrong.
Right. The paper suggests it might be about errors creeping in.
Okay. Like, the longer the chain, the more chances there are for a little mistake somewhere early on.
Exactly. A tiny error in step 2 could completely derail the calculation by step 10.
Kind of like static building up on a long phone call, or maybe building a really tall Lego tower. The higher you go.
The wobblier it gets. Yeah, that's a good analogy. Each extra step introduces another point of potential failure.
Okay.
And the researchers actually formalize this a bit mathematically. They talk about error accumulation. Proposition 4.2, I think.
So even if the model is pretty accurate on each individual step, those small probabilities of error compound over a long chain.
Precisely. It's like that game of telephone. The message gets more garbled the further down the line it goes.
It makes a lot of sense. So it's not just about steps, it's about managing the risk that comes with more steps.
Which leads right to this idea of an optimal length. Not too short, not too long.
The Goldilocks zone for thinking.
Kind of. And they actually prove, theoretically, that this optimal length exists. Theorem 4.3, I believe.
Okay, so it's not just an observation, there's math behind it.
Right. And what's really key is what influences this ideal length. They pinpoint 2 main things.
Which are?
Task difficulty and model capability.
Okay, let's break those down. Task difficulty. That seems intuitive.
It does, right. The harder the problem, generally, the more steps you'd expect are needed to solve it properly.
Yeah, if something's really complex, you probably do need to break it down more. Like tackling a dense academic paper versus, I don't know, a news summary.
Exactly. You need more intermediate steps to bridge the gap. And the experiments back this up. They found the optimal CoT length tended to be longer for more difficult tasks.
Okay, so harder problems benefit from more steps, but presumably still not too many because of that error accumulation thing.
Precisely. It pushes the optimal point further out, but there's still a peak.
Got it. And the second factor, model capability.
Right. This one's also interesting. The research suggests that more powerful models, the smarter ones, can often achieve their best performance with fewer reasoning steps.
Oh, so a smarter model doesn't need to spell everything out in tiny detail.
Kind of. It seems they can handle more complex reasoning within a single step. They can make bigger logical leaps, maybe, so they don't need as many intermediate steps to get to the answer effectively.
They're more efficient thinkers.
In a way, yeah. We saw hints of that even in Figure 1 with the GPT-2 models. The larger version sometimes peaked with slightly shorter chains on the harder tasks compared to the smaller one.
Okay, that's a really crucial finding. The ideal number of steps isn't fixed. It depends on how good the model is and how tough the problem is.
Exactly. And they have Figure 4 in the paper visually represents this interplay really well. You can see how that optimal length shifts based on both model size and task difficulty.
So this wasn't just in their controlled synthetic math problems, right?
Yeah.
Did they check this on, like, real stuff?
They did. They moved on to much harder real-world math problems. They used datasets like math.
Okay, those are like competition-level math questions, right? Really tough.
Yeah, exactly. And they tested models like Qwen 2.5 and the newer Llama 3.1 models.
And what happened there? Same pattern?
Pretty much, yes. Figure 5 shows it. Even on these really complex problems, just making the chain of thought longer and longer wasn't the guaranteed path to success.
So more steps didn't always mean better scores on those hard math problems either.
Right. And interestingly, they again saw that as the models got bigger and more capable comparing different sizes within the Qwen family, for instance, the optimal reasoning length actually tended to get shorter.
Wow. So it mirrors what they saw in the simple setup. Bigger brain, fewer steps needed for peak performance.
It seems so. And digging into the details, like in Figure 5C and also Figures 7 and 8, which are in the appendix, they found a pretty clear relationship with difficulty again. The harder the problem measured by how often the model initially got it wrong, the longer the optimal CoT tended to be.
So again, tougher questions need more thinking steps.
Up to that optimal point, it reinforces that the principles they found in the synthetic tasks seem to hold up in more realistic, challenging scenarios.
Which really hammers home that point. Longer isn't always better, isn't just some weird artifact of simple problems.
Exactly. It highlights how critical it is to think about the model you're using and the task you're giving it when you rely on chain of thought. You can't just assume more detail is always good.
Okay, so this leads to a really practical question then. If there's this optimal length, this sweet spot, can we actually use that knowledge? Like, can we train models to be better at finding it?
That's a great question, and the paper touches on it. Figure 6 shows something pretty cool.
Yeah.
They took a smaller model and specifically trained it using examples where the chain of thought reasoning was close to the optimal length they'd identified for those tasks.
Okay, so targeted training data.
Right. And that smaller model, trained on optimal length examples, actually outperformed a larger model that was just trained on randomly selected CoT examples where the lengths might have been all over the place.
Whoa, hang on. A smaller model beat a bigger one.
Just by being trained on reasoning of the right length.
That's pretty significant. It suggests the quality and structure of the reasoning and the training data matters a lot.
It really does. It implies that if you train a model on lots of examples that are way too long or way too short, you might actually be hindering its ability to learn effective multi-step reasoning.
You're not teaching it to find that balance.
Exactly. So curating training data with near-optimal copy lengths could potentially give us big performance boosts, especially maybe for smaller, more efficient models.
Making smaller models punch above their weight just by training them smarter. That's a really powerful insight for developing these things.
Definitely.
Okay, but what about when we're actually using these models? We often don't know the perfect number of steps beforehand for a specific new problem, right?
True. You can't always pre-calculate the ideal length.
So how do we handle that uncertainty? The paper proposed something called length-filtered vote.
Yeah, exactly. Length-filtered vote. It's a clever inference time technique.
Okay, how does that work? Is it like combining answers?
Sorta. You know how sometimes you might ask the model the same question multiple times with CoT, hoping it generates different reasoning paths, and then you just pick the most common final answer? That's called majority voting or self-consistency.
Right, okay. Standard practice.
Length-filtered vote builds on that. The core idea laid out in algorithm 1 is to not just look at the final answers, but to group them by the length of the chain of thought that produced them.
Okay. So group answers from 5-step chains, 6-step chains, 7-step chains, etc.
Exactly. And then for each group, they look at how much the answers within that group agree with each other. They use a measure called Shannon entropy.
Okay, entropy. Like a measure of randomness or uncertainty.
Yeah. Precisely. If all the answers produced by, say, 6-step chains are identical, the entropy for that length group is very low. High consistency, low uncertainty.
But if the 10-step chains produce a scattershot of different answers, the entropy is high.
Right. The hypothesis is that reasoning lengths closer to the optimal length for that task and model will produce answers with lower entropy, more consistency. The model is more sure of itself at that length.
Interesting. So lengths that are too short or way too long might lead to more inconsistent, uncertain answers.
That's the idea. So the length-filtered vote method identifies these low-entropy length groups, the ones where the model seems more confident and only considers the answers from those groups when performing the final majority vote.
It's basically filtering out the answers that came from potentially unreliable reasoning lengths, the ones that are likely too short or too long.
Exactly. It prioritizes the answers from the more stable reasoning lengths.
And did it work?
Apparently, yes. Table 1 shows the results on a dataset called GPQA. Length-filtered vote consistently outperformed standard majority voting across different models and different numbers of samples drawn.
That's really promising. It means we might be able to get more reliable answers from LLMs using CoT without needing to know that exact optimal length beforehand.
Yeah, it's a practical strategy to mitigate the downsides of both underthinking and overthinking at inference time by focusing on where the model shows self-consistency based on reasoning length.
You're implicitly homing in on the more trustworthy results.
It seems that way. You're giving more weight to the thought processes that are likely closer to that optimal balance.
Okay, let's try and wrap this all up then. We started with this common sense idea. More thinking, more steps in chain of thought should equal better answers from LLMs.
Right, the intuitive approach.
But this research, when more is less, paints a much more nuanced picture. There's actually an optimal length for CoT.
A sweet spot. Go too short, you underthink. Go too long.
You overthink, and performance drops. Probably because tiny errors start adding up and derailing the process.
Exactly. And that sweet spot isn't fixed. It depends critically on two things we discussed.
Right. How hard the task is.
Harder tasks generally need more steps, up to a point.
And how capable the model is.
Smarter models seem to reach peak performance with fewer, maybe more complex reasoning steps.
And we saw this holds up not just in theory or simple tasks, but also in complex real-world math problems.
Definitely. The evidence from datasets like math using modern LLMs supports these core findings.
And then we touched on the practical side. The potential to train models better by using optimally sized reasoning examples.
Which could even let smaller models outperform larger ones trained less carefully.
And this length-filtered vote technique, using the consistency of answers at different CoT lengths to filter out the noise and hopefully get a better final result.
Yeah, a practical way to leverage this understanding during inference.
So the big takeaway really is, when using chain of thought with LLMs, more isn't automatically better.
Absolutely. It's about finding that balance, matching the reasoning depth to the model's ability and the problem's complexity. That seems to be the key to unlocking the real power of multi-step reasoning in these models. Not too little, not too much.
You know, listening to all this, it makes me wonder about, well, us, our own thinking.
How so?
Like, do we fall into these traps too? Do we sometimes tackle complex issues with too few steps, just jumping to conclusions? Or maybe more often, do we get stuck overthinking things, adding step after step, analyzing endlessly, maybe losing the plot, or introducing our own errors?
That's a really interesting parallel, this idea of optimal thinking.